Macca's Guides.
Hey guys, Macca here, playing Call of Duty Modern Warfare, and in this video we're playing Mission 13, Going Dark, and we're going to grab both of the achievements or trophies available in this level. The first one is pretty easy and called Lights Out. It's for shutting off the power to all 4 buildings in the level. The first building is automatic and a part of progress, and then the other 3 buildings, you'll need to go to them. Just make sure you find the little fuse boxes at the Clocktower, the church, and the pool. The other achievement or trophy is kind of the tough one and the main point of this video. It's called We Own the Night, and it's for killing all of the enemies at the church, Clocktower, and pool. Now, I prefer to go to the Clocktower first, then the church, and then the pool, but it's up to you. And if you at any point get caught, make sure that you do reload your checkpoint immediately, as this level has a checkpoint that goes off like literally every 5 to 10 seconds sometimes. So in total, the amount of enemies at the Clocktower is 10. There are a couple of tricky ones, mainly the one outside of the gate, which I already grabbed. That one's kind of easy. But then there is 1 or sometimes 2 enemies that roam around the outside. Sometimes they end up in the courtyard out front. Sometimes they end up in the alleyway out back. And every time I've played this level, the enemy locations are just slightly different. 1 or 2 enemies will end up roaming to a place I've never seen them before. So I don't know if there's a 100% strategy that will work for everyone. However, I would highly recommend you clear the buildings in the same kind of order as I do. And you should come across the same enemies as I do, just sometimes in slightly different paths. So far, I think we've taken out 5 or 6 of the enemies here in the Clocktower. There's sometimes an enemy right here in this room. If he's not here, he's usually in the courtyard just to the right of the door, so that's going to be him right there. And then I killed 2 enemies in this room right in front of me. Sometimes there's only 1 and 1 comes down the staircase. Sometimes both of them are already in that room. Just make sure you're keeping a mental note and a count on how many enemies you've already taken out. Now, once you get upstairs, there's a couple of scripted enemies. This enemy almost always comes out of the door once you reach the top of the stairs. And then when you cross over to the other side of the house, an enemy almost always comes out of the right side. And those 2 are kind of more scripted. Some of them roam, some of them are more scripted. It really depends on how you get through and how much noise you make. If you shoot windows, it can also make enemies investigate the area, which can kind of help them come out and help you find them better. I would also highly suggest a really good headset in order for you to be able to just hear the enemies walking around you. It'll give you a really good idea of exactly where they are. Sometimes when you cycle back down, an enemy will come to investigate, so make sure you take them out. And make sure you go to the back alley behind the area, and there will be an enemy here, sometimes standing on a cigarette break, sometimes looting the inside of a car. So make sure you take out that enemy, which is probably the trickiest one for this area and possibly the reason you aren't unlocking your achievement or trophy. Once you have 10 total enemies in the Clocktower, what you can do is investigate the hostage, and then we can move on to the church. Now, the church kind of plays out in 1 or 2 ways. You can remain completely stealthy, but sometimes the church kind of forces you into what seems like an alarm state, but it's not really an alarm state. Essentially, sometimes Captain Price will shoot out a light for you, and it seems like sometimes the enemies want to investigate that light, and sometimes they don't. However, what is consistent is we need to kill 13 enemies here. And 2 enemies are kind of tricky. They're a little bit across the street. Another 2 enemies are kind of tricky because sometimes they're right where you walk in. So we're going to be walking in here next to kind of the graveyard cemetery. There's a little building here, which I guess is the mausoleum. It has a light on it. And I'm kind of approaching from the back side. But there's sometimes these 2 enemies out back in the left-hand side that you can take out right when you arrive. However, sometimes they arrive late and they crawl up through a crawl space underneath the church. And they won't be there right away. So make sure you keep that in mind. You check on it first, and then we check on it later when we leave. So there's a total of 13 enemies. 2 of them I already found. 2 of them came here to investigate, but they won't always investigate. They'll usually just be sitting kind of right here where I'm looking. We'll take a 5th and a 6th one out here. Those guys also sometimes come out to investigate, but sometimes just kind of chill out the front. Now what we need here is just around the corner, there's also another fuse box, which I'll take care of. There's also an enemy that usually stands outside of this fuse box, and right as you round the corner, it seems somewhat scripted that the turret gunner comes by. So make sure that you take your time here and don't get spotted. So we're going to take care of the fuse box. What usually happens when you take care of this fuse box is an enemy will come out to inspect it, and there's usually an enemy right behind him, and if you're spotted in front of the door right as the door opens, you are likely to get killed pretty much immediately every time. So what I prefer to do is just kind of leave the area and then look across the street from the fuse box into this small wooded area. There's sometimes one, sometimes two enemies here. Take out whoever you see. Afterwards, one of the enemies should come inspect the fuse box, and you can take them out, and then there's usually an enemy right behind them in the first room. There's going to be 4 total enemies inside of the church, including the enemy that comes to investigate after you take out the fuse box. So we've taken out all 4 inside, and we should have that mental counter. My mental counter is at 12, meaning I missed an enemy, and it's usually going to be either the 2 people at the very beginning who I killed, the guy across the street that I killed right after manipulating the fuse box, or there's a guy that kind of tends to stand near the middle of the street, right where this vehicle in front of me is about to pass by. So that should be my 13th out of 13. We're going to take him out, and then we are going to investigate the hostage and make our final push towards the pool, which is just a confusing mess of enemies in my opinion.
My family will come for me.
Now, from the church to the pool, there's a couple of ways to get there. I'm going to take what ends up kind of being the more risky way and kind of the back doorway. It ends up giving me pretty good access to a lot of the enemies very quickly, but it makes the enemies move around a lot more, meaning you can get stuck on a roamer. So it'll just take a little bit longer, but it's really not that bad. You may encounter some enemies along the way, and that's completely fine. Those are usually enemies related to the embassy or just the general level. They don't really count under any of the 3 areas we're going for in terms of this achievement. Now, at the pool, you may be asking, well, we had 10, then we had 13. How many are at the pool? And the real answer is it really kind of depends on who comes to investigate. So as I climb up these stairs here, the stairs are kind of connected to the embassy, and sometimes an enemy from the embassy will be walking down the stairs, and I'm going to take him out so that I can make progress. However, he doesn't count as an enemy from the pool. And then what happens is I shoot a couple of enemies just around the corner right here, and it breaks some glass, which makes more enemies investigate, but not all of the enemies count as pool enemies necessarily. The pool kind of has a very obvious fence around it, and all you need to do is kill everyone within the confines of that fence. So I'm approaching here from kind of the back side. You can approach from the beginning. Just make sure you're taking care of all of the enemies, one-tapping them, making sure they don't notice you or set off any alarms, and if they do, immediately make sure you reload that checkpoint. Now, what I'm going to do here is approach from the back, and I'm going to interact with the fuse box. You may notice that there is a ladder right next to that fuse box, and you can climb that ladder, and there's sometimes enemies on the roof. However, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a quick check, actually, out here, because I heard enemies on my headset. These guys came to investigate from what I believe is the embassy, and they don't count. However, these 2 guys that I just took out do count. It can get very confusing as enemies from outside of the area come to investigate, but as long as you're taking enemies out and none of them are shooting at you, you're still fine. So I'm going to take out that fuse box and head to the roof. The roof sometimes has enemies and sometimes doesn't. Sometimes they'll run down to inspect, and sometimes they'll kind of crawl down a ladder and end up inside of the building. Now, inside of the building next to the hostage, there's usually 3 enemies. It's not always 3 because they like to wander like much of the enemies. So just take out the ones you can spot nearby, making sure to take them out in a way where none of them are alerted to each other's positions. And then what I did, I decided to drop down into the pool room and just kind of use my headset and run around the area until I heard enemies and making sure to take them out. There's usually at least 2 enemies in the front courtyard, which would be the courtyard closest to where we repelled from. And you should see those enemies, I believe, through this door right here. So they'll sometimes be chilling near that garbage. However, one of them ended up leaving to go to the left here to inspect something and then was on his way back. And then there will be another one as well, kind of, you'll see him basically where we just were. There will be an enemy, but he only comes back on a cycle every now and again. So I made my way back in. I'm using that headset. I'm listening for enemy patterns, and one of the enemies does come back to find the pool. Like I said, there should be 3 enemies at the pool. We only killed 2, so one of them was bound to come back eventually. And like I said, there was 2 in the front yard. I only killed 1, and one of them was bound to come back eventually. So there's usually 2 by the garbage, or they kind of split up and go on their paths, and one ends up by the fuse box, being my last. I ended up killing what I believe was 12 people, but I think I killed 1 or 2 extra people who were investigating from an area that didn't count. Sorry to be a little bit vague, but the pool can be a really tricky place in terms of counting and in terms of what enemies come and spawn and the order of those enemies. So I hope this video was helpful nonetheless. Leave a like, subscribe for future videos. Special thanks to everyone on Patreon for supporting the show. Shout out to the below, and hopefully I see you next time. Peace!